Welcome to English at Leeds Trinity podcast. I'm Richard Storer, I'm a lecturer in English at Leeds Trinity, and this is a special episode because we are not in the studio this time. We've gone not exactly on the road, but we have gone down the corridor and across the campus, and we're here in the library for a special session with an audience of students and staff at Leeds Trinity, and this is part of what we call English Week, which we try to have at the end of each year, just sort of celebrating all different aspects of English literature, language, creative writing. And so I'm very pleased to welcome Martyn Bedford to this session. Martyn is a lecturer in creative writing here at Leeds Trinity, but he is also a published novelist. And so what I thought would be good to do would be to take the opportunity to ask him some questions about several of his novels, and in that way just find out a bit more from the author himself, the process of putting together novels. So Martyn, thank you very much.
Thank you. Good morning. Nice to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
I'll just say a little bit of a profile. We want this to be a bit like an event at a literary festival. It's not quite like that because there's no bookstall out there where you can...
Wouldn't have come if there was no bookstall.
And usually the author who comes to a literary festival for a question and answer session is in the process of promoting their latest book. And I thought it might be quite interesting in this case if we actually don't have to do that, but instead if we go back and sort of dig back into Martyn's kind of back catalogue and focus a little bit on particular novels that he's published before. But I'll just outline the background. So Martyn is the author of at least 8 novels we've got, and many of them have been translated into other languages besides English. He started, I think, in 1996 with Acts of Revision. And then we've got Exit, Orange and Red. Got most of them are here on the table in front of us. The Houdini Girl, Black Cat, and then The Island of Lost Souls. And then he made the interesting sort of change of direction to focus on writing in the young adult genre, which is obviously something that is very kind of popular genre for readers. And with that, in that genre, he published Flip, Never Ending, and 20 Questions for Gloria. I got that.
I'm very impressed you got all 8 books in the right order, yeah.
Okay.
You didn't mention the short story collection, but I'm
the
happy
short story collection, I'm really sorry.
Yes,
I said yes. Okay, there's also a short story collection and lots of other sort of text here and there in other collections.
I can't tell you how many times I've been incorrectly introduced at literature festivals, including, please welcome Malcolm Bradford.
Right, okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to focus on the 2 novels, The Island of Lost Souls and then 20 Questions for Gloria. And because we haven't all read those, I've read both those and really enjoyed them, found them very memorable. And I thought this would be a great opportunity to ask Martyn about those, but not everyone in the audience has read them. So what we've done is we have looked at 2 passages from those novels. We've had a good look at them and thought of some questions that we would like to ask Martyn about them. They're 2 passages that I think are very kind of memorable, sort of stand out. Everything in the 2 novels is very memorable, but these have a kind of standalone quality almost because they're so sort of unexpected. And so we've listened to those already, and we have talked about them, and so we've got some questions. So we're going to go straight away into our questions. And the first novel that we're going to think about is The Island of Lost Souls, and the passage that we're going to think about is from the chapter that is called The Birdmen. Martyn, would you like to just start by just telling us the context for this chapter? It's fairly early on in the novel, isn't it? Without kind of giving away the whole plot of the rest of what happens afterwards.
The setup for Island of Lost Souls is that it's set in an imagined near future, a dystopian near future, where there's a global war taking place, and the country in which my protagonist Finn lives has reintroduced conscription, so compulsory military service in the war. He objects to the war on a matter of principle, but also on a matter of not wanting to get himself killed. So the novel is really a story of his attempts to avoid the draft, to become a draft dodger. And early on in the novel, a very traumatic episode which happens in his life is that his older brother, who has gone and fought in the war, has been invalided home with a serious injury, having lost a foot in battle, and has been sent home with half of his leg missing, and then is psychologically damaged and traumatised by his experiences in the war and by what's happened to him. And he, this isn't giving away too much of the plot in terms of the later part of the novel because it happens quite early on, he, in his confused and disturbed state, saws off the other foot so that his legs now match, and Finn catches him in the act of having just done this, and the blood loss causes his brother to die as a result of what he's done. Off the back of that, Finn, having toyed with the idea of going on the run but being afraid because the punishment for getting caught and the likelihood of actually escaping on the run was quite risky, he has decided that after what's happened to his brother, he really has no choice but to do what he can to avoid having to fight. He's so traumatised by that. So he's made contacts with the underworld, who provide a kind of escape route of safe houses and a network of people working behind the scenes to try and help draft dodgers to escape, modelled on what happened in America during the Vietnam War, where people escaped over the border to Canada to avoid fighting for the Americans in Vietnam. And just leading up to this scene, he's been told that he should go to a particular cafe at a particular time and order an iced coffee, which is a sort of way of indicating who he is to the person who's going to meet him. And he's been told that his contact will be a Mr. Finlay. So we join him in this scene. I think the passage you read is when the birdmen arrive in the latter part of the scene, but in the earlier part of the chapter, Finn has been sitting there anxiously waiting, sipping this iced coffee, wondering if he's been set up, if it's a trap, or whether there's going to be a genuine contact, and just wondering who this contact will be. And then the birdmen scene sort of follows on from that.
Okay, we are now going to listen to that scene being read by Lana.
In the cafe, Finn shut his eyes. He wished that when he reopened them, it would be 6 months, a year, 5 years from now, and he wouldn't know precisely how many hours ago his brother had died. And every other thought in his head wouldn't be about Kurt's jaw, Kurt's foot, or that, opening them again, he would see Mr. Finlay standing there beside the table, smiling, ready to put an arm around him and usher him away from all this, take him somewhere safe and kind and deathless. What Finn saw, though, when he opened his eyes, was the first of the birdmen. An old boy with scabs on his bald scalp and a too big quilted coat, so that only his fingers showed beyond the cuffs. The coat was cerise, rain-spotted. In one hand he held a brass cage in the shape of a bell jar, the ring at its apex looped over the crook of his middle finger. Inside was a speckled bird Finn couldn't name, thumb-sized. It sat right at one end of its perch, head cocked, leaning a little, as if compensating for the tilt of the cage. The man nabbed a chair from one of the outside tables and stepped onto it with care, then straightened, raising the cage above his head and securing it on a hook set into the canopy framework. Finn hadn't noticed these hooks, but saw now that there were several along each joist. The man got down, wiped the chair with his cuff, and sat on it. A waitress appeared by his side. By the time she returned with his order, coffee and an aperitif of some kind, 2 more birdmen had arrived. Each hooked their cages above the same table and joined the first man. Others came, all men, all old, some doing a shuffle walk, and before long the outside tables were full. 20 or so birds were arranged over the men's heads by now, 1 or 2 of the cages swaying slightly where they had yet to settle, like lanterns, Finn thought. When the last of them was up and their owners all had drinks in front of them, the punters who'd been inside the cafe began to file out, taking their cups and glasses with them to stand wherever there was room beneath the canopy. Finn joined them, mesmerised by the spectacle, the ritual of it all. The air reverent as the murmurs of conversation ebbed away to the sort of hush that heralds a sacred ceremony. "What birds are these?" he whispered to a woman as they went out. "Songbirds," the woman said, and that was all. Outside in the fresh damp air, he huddled in among the others. Nobody spoke. Everyone stood as still as they could, so as not to jostle the birdmen at their tables amid the throng, sipping their drinks, smiling fondly at each other, at faces in the crowd, and most of all at their birds in the cages above their heads. The birds sang, an ululating chorus of trills, chirrups and warbles, each one so idiosyncratic, so dissociated from the rest, that the result should have been discordant, but was, instead, sweetly melodic, harmonious as any concert orchestra. As the comparison struck him, Finn saw one birdman patterning the air with a spoon as though conducting. Scattered spores of birdsong permeated the space beneath the canopy. Surround sound. Each cage a speaker issuing its own notes into the mix, blocking out interference, filling your ears, your head. You heard nothing but the music, yet you strained for every nuance, as if the melody might be drowned out at any moment and lost forever. The cafe, though, sat in a little-used street, so there was no traffic noise for the birds to compete against. Even the spatter of rainwater and an occasional chink of cup against saucer acted as a percussive accompaniment. Finn had never heard anything like it. The concert, for that's what it was, he decided, lasted until the birdmen had finished their drinks. To Finn, it seemed a long time, but also too short, too abruptly ended. Singly or in pairs, as they drained their coffees and their aperitifs, the old men stood on their chairs to retrieve the cages, and after a few handshakes here and there, they dispersed. No bills for them to settle, Finn noticed. The waitresses simply stood smiling in the cafe doors and watched them leave. Even before the last of the men had departed, their audience began to go their separate ways along the rain-swept street. A sense of strangers sharing in something magical had developed while the birds sang. Now it was over. The drawing together quickly became a drifting apart. But Finn felt sure that each of them took a fragment of the togetherness with them. He saw it in their faces. This, now he thought about it, was almost as magical as what they'd just witnessed. It was cold again, with a thinning of the crowd. He realised that he hadn't moved from the spot where he'd stood during the birdsong. Beyond the cafe's glass frontage, he registered his pack, still stashed under the table, the unfinished iced coffee. Finn was making his way back there when the last of the birdmen put a hand on his shoulder to steady himself as he lowered his cage from its hook.
Lana's going to ask the first question.
Is the concert of birds based on something you experienced yourself?
Yeah, I went travelling in, well, quite a lot in different parts of the world when I was in my early 20s, and spent some time in Singapore when I was in Southeast Asia. And while I was there, I went to a cafe, unaware of what kind of cafe it was. It was just a regular cafe as far as I knew. And while I was sitting there drinking and sort of writing up my diary, this is old school travelling, these elderly Chinese men started... Singapore's quite diverse racially and ethnically, as Malay, Tamil, Chinese, all sorts of ethnic groups. But this particular cafe was in one of the Chinese areas. And a group of elderly Chinese men started arriving one by one, in the way I describe in this scene, with songbirds in cages, and started hanging them up on hooks from the frame of the canopy out the front of the cafe in the way that happens in the scene. And then sitting down and drinking their... Well, most of them were drinking coffee, some of them were drinking shots or brandies and whiskies and so on. But basically they just sat there and let the birds sing to each other. The congregation of birds, they all seemed to sort of spark off of each other and communally start singing their songs. And then this went on for about half an hour, 40 minutes or so, and then the birdmen sort of got up and gathered their birds and left again. It was a really strange thing. I've never seen anything like it. I've looked it up since, and apparently it's not that unusual in Chinese communities that this is a thing that happens. So yeah, it was based on an actual experience that I witnessed, and I more or less replicate it in the scene here as it actually happened, except obviously I'm seeing it through Finn's perspective in the circumstances of him awaiting a contact. But the actual events that play out are pretty much identical to what I'd witnessed.
It was a completely new one on me. I don't know if anyone else has ever experienced anything like it, so it's really interesting to know that actually. there are places where this actually does happen.
It was lovely, actually. It was a really, really lovely moment, yeah.
I'll ask Linda to ask the next question.
So my question is about the writing process. So as you were writing the novel, at what point did this scene become part of the novel?
It wasn't there at the outset. I mean, the way I tend to write my novels generally is that I have a rough sort of outline. I've sort of got a rough idea of the end point that I want to get to, although that usually changes along the way, and usually half a dozen key plot points along the route. So I'm not one of these people who plans it chapter by chapter in its entirety, and I'm not one of these people who just flies by the seat of their pants and has no plan at all. But I have a rough outline and a kind of narrative thread with a few key plot points threaded through it. And this wasn't one of those. I knew I wanted Finn to have a meeting, or a clandestine meeting with someone who would help him to escape to a safe house. But I hadn't at the outset decided where that would happen or how it would happen. So it was as I was approaching that point in the narrative, I started to think, well, what kind of scene could I write that would enable that to happen? And that episode with the Birdman had always been in my mind as something I would like to write about in fiction in some way. And it just seemed suitably strange and odd and curious, to be unsettling and slightly uncanny. And was it unheimlich, the sort of the phrase that's used in literature for that kind of uncanniness? So I thought it would lend itself to the kind of uneasy nature of the episode. And also my dystopian future world in The Island of Lost Souls is very, it's a tough, grim, monochrome, grey, harsh place. It's a sort of not a nice place to live in. And I just wanted a moment of sort of beauty and melody to sort of puncture that, to act as a counterpoint to that to provide contrast to that, really. So it came in the process of writing the novel rather than beforehand planning it out.
Because it's a very moving reference, I think, at the beginning, where he's sitting there and he wants somebody to just kind of say it's all right. He wants some reassurance, doesn't he? Because he's in such sort of turmoil, and he doesn't exactly get that. And it is still quite an unfriendly world. But so he gets this rather kind of wonderful experience.
Yeah, it sort of it calms his nerves in that moment, and he needed some kind of calming or reassurance at that point. Yeah.
As we go through the questions, sometimes we may find the answer has more or less been asked already, but we're still going to go through the questions as we've sort of agreed. So, Lexi, your question now.
My question is, why did you choose a cafe in particular?
Might repeat the question.
Yeah, the question was, why did I choose a cafe in particular for this scene? Well, partly because it was based on personal experience, and partly because I felt that kind of meeting would happen in a public place, really. Somewhere where Finn could sort of blend into the background, and a conversation with a stranger might not seem odd. And in an earlier scene, he meets someone in a nightclub where someone presses a card into his hand with a contact detail which precedes this arrangement to meet the Mr. Finlay, in inverted commas. So having set one scene already in a nightclub, I thought I wanted another public place, and a cafe seemed to be like the good kind of place that Finn could just blend into the background. Although he's so self-conscious, he feels like he might as well have a sign on his head saying draft dodger, because he feels everyone must be aware of. And we've all probably experienced that, haven't we, where we think everyone can see what we're bothered about, but to everyone else we just look perfectly normal. So.
Right. Thank you. Okay, and so now Hamim has got a question.
I was going to ask, what was the reason behind the Birdmen being elderly, and why about old men?
It was based on the reason for choosing elderly sort of white men in this case, but it was because that was what happened in the incident I'd seen for myself. So, I mean, it was elderly men who brought the birds. I wanted there to be a sort of hint. It's not spelled out, but it might be possible for readers to pick it up, perhaps, that it's mainly men who are being called to fight in this war predominantly, and Finn has just seen his brother injured and then die as a result of it. And here we have the elderly male community who are too old to go and fight, who cling to a kind of pre-dystopian beauty and being in touch with something wonderful like birdsong, as a kind of contrast to what's going on in the battlefields for younger men, including Finn, if he doesn't manage to dodge the draft, who may be sent out to fight there. So that was another reason, although it was based on what I'd actually witnessed, that I wanted it to be elderly men who were beyond fighting age who were involved in that scene.
So it adds to that sense of sort of a community, but it's one that's out of reach
Yes.
to Finn.
Yeah, exactly. He hasn't got they are exempt and he isn't. And here he is surrounded by these people who can't be sent to fight. Yeah.
Thank you. And it's still on the subject of the birdmen, particularly in relation to the plot. I think, Samir, you've got a question.
The birdmen, they arrive one by one and they eventually all move out, but are they associated with the escape organisation?
No, I mean, one of them is, as you discover at the end of the scene, the guy who engages Finn in conversation right at the end is effectively the contact, and the others are just part of the group. And his sort of, in the way that Finn is trying to hide himself among regular cafe users to appear just like a guy who's having a nice coffee, the birdman who makes the contact with him is disguising himself amongst the other birdmen by just being one of that group. So the idea is that if they are being observed or if anyone's aware that this plan might be taking place, no one could identify anyone as being involved in the situation. But no, the other birdmen aren't involved. It's just that one particular contact.
Sometimes in novels there's sort of really small details, and it's just interesting to ask you if you can think of a reason why it's that detail. This is what Libby's question is going to be.
Yes, so how did you arrive at 20 for the number of birds?
Richard sent me these questions yesterday to get a sort of sneak preview of them, and I read that one and thought, I really can't remember. There must have been some brilliant reason, but I suspect what it is was, well, I've got to come up with a number, so 20 will do. But no, there wasn't a particular reason for that.
I suppose 50 would have been a bit too much of a...
Yeah. I mean, it was probably based roughly on the number that there would have been at the thing that I witnessed, although I didn't count them to know that, but it felt like there was around that number. So, but there was no particular, there's no hidden coded message in the number of 20 there.
Sort of following on from that, Brogan, another question.
Is the name Finn of any particular significance?
No, none whatsoever, other than that I quite like that name. And when we had our children, Finn was potentially going to be a boy's name, but we had 2 daughters. So if you can't actually have the child, you can use their name in a novel. It's great.
Right. I've got a question that's also about the focus on the birdman. The first birdman, when he arrives, I was really kind of caught out by the fact that his coat is described as cerise, which I couldn't even think what colour that is. But then I looked it up. It is actually a kind of deep pink. And I can't sort of picture an old man wearing a sort of deep pink coat. I wonder if was there a thinking behind it? Was it deliberate?
No, that was another think of a colour, any colour
kind
of situation. I quite like the word cerise.
Yes, definitely.
Because it's one of those quirky kind of words that not everyone would know exactly what colour it meant. But no, there's no hidden motive behind it.
Right. It's not. Because you'd thought he would actually rather stand out wearing that.
Well, but that can be a kind of double bluff in that situation.
Yes.
That the most likely person to be the sort of spy, if you like, is perhaps too obvious. So there was, if there was anything going on, it was that. But I think really it was just I'll have to think of a colour for this. I mean, I like to create a visual image in the reader's mind when they're reading a scene, and colour can be one way of doing that. There's a question relating to the other book we're looking at about why I chose a red T-shirt for the guy doing the tightrope walking, and similarly that was, I want the reader to have a visual impression of this person, and I wanted to choose a striking colour that would stick in their mind as a detail. So I think that's I've already preempted one of the questions in the second discussion as well. Apologies to the person who's questioned that was. Yeah.
But I think we'll all go away then with the word. We've had our memory of the word cerise refreshed. It is quite an unusual word for a colour, isn't it?
Of the word cherry, I think, which is...
I think so, yes. Okay, and now Humera has got a question.
Did you find this scene actually difficult to write, or do you remember making any major changes to it?
I didn't find the description of what happens with the birdmen arriving that difficult, because it was based on something I'd witnessed, and I'd written notes in my diary when I was travelling at the time, so I could refer back to those. So the sort of the architecture of the scene, of what happens and how it happens and so on, and the visual, and I took some photographs of it at the time it happened as well. So writing what happened wasn't problematic, other than finding the right words and the right way of phrasing things. But the harder part was to sort of tie it into Finn's perspective and to make it related to what he's thinking and feeling at that particular point because of the sort of situation he's in and the anxiety there, and his being transported out of that for a moment while it was happening. So the harder part was to sort of take my experience and transpose it onto someone else's experience in their emotional state that they're in. So that was the trickier challenge. I don't remember there being massive rewrites. I mean, this book's quite old now. It was quite a while ago when I wrote it. But I don't remember there being particularly difficult rewrites with this passage. I mean, there were other parts of the novel that were heavily rewritten, but this one I remember being relatively straightforward in terms of adjusting and fine-tuning.
Right, thank you. And Motiba has got a question.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask, because for me, birdsong reminds me of doves, and they're typically symbols of peace and death. And I noticed that throughout this whole extract, there's a theme of war, and we've got songbirds instead. Was the dove thing a symbol in mind when you first wrote that?
Not doves particularly, but birds as generally creatures that we think of as being sort of associated with nature and harmony and tranquility. I mean, actually, they're not really, are they? I mean, bird song is often very aggressive. It's territorial. This is my area, clear off. Or I need a woman, where's a woman, I want to have sex, basically is what bird song is, isn't it? I mean, it sounds lovely, but basically they're being territorially aggressive or sexually promiscuous when they sing. But nevertheless, we associate them with lovely things to do with harmony and melody and peace and nature and tranquility. So I wanted that to be as a contrast. So not doves specifically, but then obviously the dove personifies that particular, I mean, it is the bird of peace, isn't it? But I also wanted it, there was an echo there, a very hidden echo to the Sebastian Faulks novel Bird Song, which is set during the First World War in the trenches. And there's a sort of homage to that novel in the reference to songbirds as a reversal of his book title. But again, that's so buried that you'd barely even spot it, really.
Well, I thought it was interesting that Finn asks the woman, what kind of birds are these? And she just says songbirds.
Yes. Yeah.
Which, if you might ask somebody that, they might give you a whole lecture on different species of birds.
Yeah.
But
it's interesting, really. I go for a lot of country walks. Is the thing I do at weekends, and I hear birdsong and I look at trees, but I could only name a handful of them, really. Most people who grow up in towns and cities are aware of birds, but it'd be very hard to name more than... I can tell the difference between a duck and a swan, for example, but anything more complicated than that, and it gets a bit trickier, really.
It's hard to imagine this scene taking place with ducks and swans.
No, it wouldn't work, really. That would have involved some rewriting, I think.
Yeah. We've got time for one or two more questions. I just wanted to, following on from that question, Motiba, about the war and everything. I mean, this novel was published in 2006, I think. What we were saying yesterday was that there's quite a lot of resonance for this now. The idea of draft dodging, escaping from the war, not fortunately in Britain, but with the whole situation in Ukraine, and particularly perhaps in Russia, where there is a draft, and it's a lot of people don't particularly want to go, and so there are a lot of people are finding ways to escape. It sort of makes you think, actually, how difficult that must be, how perilous, how stressful the whole sort of experience.
Well, it raises those two central questions that are at the heart of Finn's dilemma. Is would you want to fight for your country when you don't believe in your government and what it's doing and why it's doing it? And would you want to fight for your country if it meant risking losing your life? Are you prepared to die for your country? And I suspect that attitudes to that might have shifted over generations. And one of the ideas that originated this novel was a conversation I had with my grandmother, who was born in 1895, and I had a conversation with her when I was sort of in my early 20s, not that long before she died. She was one of 4 children, 2 girls and 2 boys. Both of her brothers died in the Battle of the Somme. One was 17 and had lied about his age. The other one was 20. So she'd lost both her brothers in the Somme, and there she was as a 88-year-old woman talking about these brothers who never lived out of their teens. And it was at the time when the Falklands War was happening, and there had been rumours that there might be limited conscription in the UK to provide the troops to go and fight in the Falklands. And I remember as a young man then feeling that I politically objected. I mean, I objected to Thatcher's government on all sorts of levels, but I particularly objected to the idea of the Falklands War. And I, in that kind of gung-ho way you often are when you're in your early 20s, I wanted to be called up so that I could refuse to fight and be jailed as a conscientious objector. And I remember having a conversation with my grandmother about this, and she wasn't being judgmental of me, but she was talking about her brothers, and I just the difference of a two generations, that her brothers had fought and died for their country without qualms. In fact, one of them had lied about his age to go and fight for his country, and there I was glibly saying I would sooner be jailed for being a conscientious objector. So it made me think about the sort of ethical and moral dimensions of fighting for your country, and that's the theme of the novel, is sort of came off of that idea, really. And I mean, I hope I treat it in a more complex and nuanced way in the novel than I felt at the time as a 20-year-old when I had that. I mean, the novel actually happened, as is often the case with writers. The novel, the germ of the idea for that novel was planted with a conversation with my grandmother in the early 80s, and the novel itself appeared over 20 years later. So quite often writers have seeds of ideas that lay dormant, and then something brings them to the fore. And I think it may well have, if I remember rightly, it was the 9/11 attacks and the so-called war on terror that followed that in the early 2000s that sort of brought that idea back up to the surface again for me.
Okay, well, thank you very much. We're going to go on then to the later novel. It's interesting that The Island of Lost Souls was the last one you wrote of those 5 before you switched to the young adult genre. It wasn't a reason for?
No,
for
in fact, I did
switching.
write another adult novel after Island of Lost Souls, which I wasn't very happy with, and more importantly, nor was my publisher. So I sort of abandoned that idea and left it unfinished. I mean, it was an idea that seemed great at the time, and then when I wrote it, I thought this isn't really working out. And then I had another idea for something that eventually became Flip, which was my first teenage novel. So there wasn't a sort of that novel, Island of Lost Souls, wasn't a cut-off point between two things. There was a sort of transition period in the years that followed that, and Flip came out in 2011, so there was like a 5-year gap between those two books, in which another book was written and abandoned. So it was a bit more of a but it's interesting that you chose these 2 extracts to focus on, because they're both very pivotal moments in the novels. I mean, I've already explained why that was the case for Island of Lost Souls, and we'll go on to talk about 20 Questions for Gloria as well. But they're both pivotal scenes in the novels. But also they're the scenes that I choose when I used to promote the book and do readings when they were being published. They were the scenes or the episodes that I would choose to read at literature festivals. So you've touched on, you've described them as self-contained and set pieces, and I think because of that, they lend themselves to being read out to an audience who don't know anything about the rest of the book, really.
Oh, good. Right. Well, that's how it worked for us. That's good to know. Well, we'll go straight on to 20 Questions for Gloria then. And the passage we're going to look at is from the chapter called The Hanging Stones. So would you like to give us your introductory speech that you used to do before you read that passage?
So this, again, is relatively early in the novel. And it is one of those pivot scenes that sends the main character, Gloria, and her friend Uman off on the journey that the novel focuses on. But the setup for 20 Questions for Gloria, as the title suggests, the novel is divided into 20 chapters, each of which has a question as its title. And the question is based on a question asked to Gloria by a detective who's investigating her disappearance and the disappearance of Uman for 2 weeks. Her and this boy went on the run together to sort of just hang out together away from family and school and so on. She came back and he didn't, and the police are trying to get to the bottom of what happened, why they went on the run, whether she was in any way coerced, whether anything untoward happened, and also where is Uman. So the novel is based on alternating chapters between the police interview with Gloria, which is written in a kind of transcript form, question and answer form, and the intervening episodes, which are flashbacks to the Gloria meeting Uman and befriending him, and the two of them going off on the run together. And this is fairly early in their friendship. He's a new boy who started at her school, and they initially sort of don't get off on the best foot, but then they sort of discover that there's a kind of connection between them, and they start hanging out together. And on this point, they've been out for a walk. She's going to show him around this town that she lives in. He's a new boy having arrived. He's come to live with his grandmother, and he's a new boy in the town, and she's showing him the sights of her town and the surrounding countryside. And they've gone for a long perambulating walk around the area, and they're walking across the moor at this point, just above the town, and they come across the hanging stones where the scene that you've read is set.
Okay, well, we will listen to that scene being read by Motiba.
Did they hang people here in ye olden days? Umon asked. No. It's from the way the rocks look like they're hanging onto the side of the moor. The rocks, huge boulders, really, were dumped on the hillside by a glacier during the last ice age, I explained. From just about anywhere in the town, you could see them silhouetted against the southern skyline. Great grey blocks perch seemingly precariously on a green swathe of heather, bracken and sheep-shorn grass. I'd loved the place ever since I was old enough to scramble with my brother on the rubble, around the base of the rocks on family picnics. There's a picture of home, of Yvonne and me trying to push one of the boulders down the slope. We look like mice about to be sat on by an elephant. Behind the rocks is a disused quarry where the Victorians dug out the stone to build most of Lichbury. We studied it in geography, I told him, or history. Sometimes me and Tia come up here to watch the climbers. There were several when we arrived that day, working in pairs on different pitches in the big U-shaped bowl. Their lycra suits, safety hats, and synthetic ropes daubing bright colours onto the grey of the rock face. They climbed in silence, apart from the clink of a piton being hammered into a crevice, or the swish of rope being paid out, or an occasional echoey instruction. They'd drawn a small audience of hikers and dog walkers. For once, though, the climbers weren't the only attraction. A young guy had fixed a wire across the mouth of the old quarry and was setting himself to walk on it. 25 metres above the ground, maybe 30. High enough to kill him if he fell. Oh, wow, look at him, I said. Beside me, Amon, still regaining his breath after the walk from the disciples, said nothing, but I felt him tense up. I couldn't tell if it was fear or excitement or both. The shape of the quarry made it a perfect theatre, with us high in the upper circle. Scraps of cloud clustered overhead as if they, too, had gathered to witness the unfolding spectacle. As we edged closer to the rim to get a better view, the guy extended a leg and dabbed at the wire with his foot, like he was stepping into a bath and wanted to make sure the water wasn't too hot. His short, dark blonde hair and pale forearms glinted in the late afternoon light, and the breeze rippled his red t-shirt. He looked about 20 years old, slender as a ballet dancer. No safety net, no pole, no helmet, not even a belt clip attaching him to the wire. I started to point this out to Amon, but he nodded, like he'd already noticed it. If the guy lost his balance, he really would fall to his death. I can't watch, I whispered, but I couldn't not watch. Against the slope of the moor in the background, the wire was almost invisible, and for one startling moment as he sat off, he appeared to be walking on air. His progress was slow, but sure. He took one pointy-toed step after another, arms outstretched at his sides, fingers spread and fluttering, like the feathers at the tips of a kestrel's wings. Beneath him, the wire quivered and swayed from time to time, and he would halt, perfectly still and poised, waiting for it to steady. A cluster of spectators had gathered at the top of the path that leads into the quarry, and more were dotted around the outcrops above. The climbers had paused to watch him too. No one moved or spoke. It was as if we all held our breath, mesmerized, terrified. I remember thinking, please, someone stop him, but also not wanting him to be stopped. It was too late for that anyway. He would make it across, or not. I have a good head for heights. On the climbing wall at school, I'll be at the top and back down again before most of the others are halfway up. But watching this, my guts clenched, my skin went clammy, my mouth filled with the metallic trace of adrenaline. I pictured him losing his balance, plummeting, heard the impact, saw him lying there on the dusty, rock-studded ground, a broken mannequin in a spreading pool of blood. He made it, though. He made it. 96 steps. I counted every one. With barely a wobble, he reached the other side, to a clatter of applause and whistles and whoops from his audience, and a surge of collective relief so huge, I'm amazed we didn't all hug one another. At the top of the crag, the guy gave an exaggerated bow, waved, smiled, blew kisses. Then, casual as you like, he packed up and left. My hands were still shaking. Oman couldn't stop smiling, his eyes so glittery you'd have thought he'd been crying. He kept thanking me, as if I arranged the whole thing for his benefit. Even after the guy had gone, Oman stood at the rim of the old quarry for ages, staring at the space where the tightrope had been, as if watching the performance all over again.
Thank you. And so Mortiba has got the first question.
Yeah, so I want to ask is the incident of the tightrope walker, is that something you've experienced yourself?
Yeah, I know this is going to sound like I only ever write fiction about things I've witnessed for myself, but it does happen that this was an episode that I witnessed in exactly the place where it's described. The town in the book is named as Lichbury, but that's based on Ilkley, which is where I live. And the Hanging Stones is a disused quarry area just above Ilkley. If any of you know Ilkley, Cow Pasture Road goes out of Ilkley up towards Bingley direction, and about half a mile or so out of the town, or a mile or so out of the town, there's this disused quarry. There's a cafe there and a picnic area and so on, and it's quite a common sight to see climbers climbing the rocks in this U-shaped sort of quarry. So I'd been out for a walk on the moor and came across the very thing that the man and Gloria witnessed, which is of a young man tightrope walking across the top of the quarry. And it's the kind of 75 feet high roughly, and the only difference is that in his case he did have a clip on his belt clipped to the rope. He wasn't free tightrope walking, and if he'd fallen he would have been saved by the clip round his belt. So the thing I made different in the novel is that he isn't clipped and would die if he fell, so that was to increase the dramatic tension. The other thing obviously I had to do with this scene, as was the case with the Island of Lost Souls, is I had to transpose my experience of witnessing that onto Gloria, whose viewpoint we're in, so that I'm seeing it through her eyes rather than through my eyes. So that was the other change I had to make.
I think we're all quite relieved to know that in the real life he did have something.
Yes, yeah. It was hard to see though. When I was walking with my wife at the time, and we'd planned on sitting down there and having we brought a flask of coffee with us, and we were going to sit there and have a coffee. It's quite a nice spot on top of the rocks there above the quarry, and you can often watch the climbers climbing. And so, and we saw this tightrope walker, and at first sight, the rope or the clip with the cable connecting him wasn't immediately visible, and it did look as if he wasn't attached to anything. And then we looked again and thought, right, well, because for a moment there was that heart leaping in your mouth sort of reaction.
which I think you do get in the reading the novel, don't you?
Well, I mean, hopefully, I mean, my experience of thinking he was doing that enabled me to get inside Gloria's head when she's watching that for real. In her case, you know.
So, Libby.
Yes, so again about the writing process. At what point in the writing of the novel did this scene become part of it, and how is it important to what happened later?
Yeah, I wanted. Once Gloria has befriended Uman, having initially thought he was a bit of a jerk, really, but she sort of comes around to liking him, and I wanted her to sort of to want to show him the town and introduce him to the place and to get to know him better. So I thought I'll take them on a walkabout. I can sort of go on this walkabout. He's also someone who something bad has happened to him in his past, in which he suffered a leg injury and lung damage, and I wanted him to be walking to sort of emphasise that. There are various points in the scene leading up to this moment, which I don't know whether any of you will have read, but his breathing becomes quite ragged and he's struggling to keep up with her because he can't walk as well as he used to because he damaged his leg. So I wanted a sort of walking scene to bring that to the foreground. But also I wanted them to sort of get to know each other in that kind of out in the wilds, just the two of them kind of thing. And again, this episode of The Tightrope Walker that I'd witnessed was something a bit like the Birdmen scene in Singapore that had always been in my mind as something I would like to write about in fiction. So with them going walkabout on the moors, that seemed an obvious place she would take him to, therefore the scene seemed to lend itself to being incorporated. But it also serves a purpose in the novel, because one of the key points about the novel is that Gloria is rather safe and cautious and doesn't take risks and doesn't break rules as a default. She used to be like that when she was younger. At primary school age, she was a bit of a maverick and would get into trouble and be sort of rule breaking and go against what parents and teachers wanted to do. But as she got older, that was drummed out of her and she became quite obedient and sort of passive. And she misses that earlier sort of feistier version of herself. And one of the reasons she's attracted to Uman is that he is all of the things she used to be and wishes she was. He breaks rules, he does what he likes, he bunks off school when he feels like it, he orders pizza to be delivered to the school playground, he sort of walks out of a lesson if he's bored by it, he challenges the teachers, she sort of thinks, God, I'd love to be like, I wish I had the nerve to be like that. And one of the things that really clicks between them is that when they see this guy tightrope walking, it's a real epiphany for Uman, because he realises that living with his elderly relative and going to this school where he doesn't really fit in is not where he wants to be and the kind of person he wants to be. He wants to be back out there doing his thing, free from constraint. So seeing the tightrope walker put his life at risk to do this gives Uman the desire to just take off, and obviously, as happens, Gloria goes with him. So this scene is a really pivotal moment for them as a pair, but also for what happens afterwards.
Right, thank you. And so, Homera.
Have you yourself ever climbed or attempted to walk a tightrope?
No, I'm very poor with head for heights, really. I mean, I did, the school gym, the climbing rope stuff, but beyond that, and I didn't really enjoy that either. But no, I get very bad with heights. Climbing doesn't appeal to me at all, other than being fascinated by why other people do it and what the appeal is for them, But no, I've never done it. Yeah. I even the thought of it's making me feel a bit.
I was thinking that if this in real life, you climbers tend to be people who are very vigilant about safety, don't they? So you kind of, I was wondering, would they sort of stop and watch, or would they kind of be rushing over and wrestling him to the ground before he took off?
Yeah, I mean, I think once he's up there, there's more danger trying to stop him than letting him. Once he's on the rope, he's either going to make it across or go back or fall off, but nothing you can do is going to help him and probably make it worse, I would imagine. So I used to, the first house I lived in Ilkley, the next door neighbour had been a climber in his younger days, and his son had taken up the climbing habit, and I remember having conversations with them about climbing, and the guy next door, tragically, his first wife died in a climbing accident. And then he remarried someone else who wasn't interested in climbing at all, but he talked about climbing, and they were very safety conscious in this mantra of you must have 3 points of contact at all times, 2 feet and 1 hand, or 2 hands and 1 foot, but there was very much a sort of safety consciousness aspect, and his view was, unless you're very unlucky with sudden turns in the weather, that most climbing accidents are avoidable and are usually down to human error or people taking risks or making a misjudgment or losing concentration, really. which sounds harsh, but that was his climber's view of it.
Yeah, I think it actually sort of adds something to the scene, to my mind, that there are climbers there who are sort of watching, rather than it just being something that's going on with some other kind of audience.
Well, I wanted to make it even the climbers gobsmacked by what they're witnessing.
Yeah.
That's how serious and dangerous it is. That it's the people who professionally go up to those heights are worried about this guy. So that infects Gloria with her anxiety as well, doesn't it?
Okay, thank you. And Lana, you've got another question.
How did you manage to make this scene so tense?
Well, I think having witnessed it myself and initially thinking the guy wasn't connected to a safety harness had given me that initial, my God, this guy could die here, kind of before I realised he couldn't. So I think it was bringing that kind of, how would I feel if I was watching this? One of the key things I try and think of when I'm writing in the viewpoint of a character who isn't me is to think, well, how would I feel if I was in their situation, to try and sort of inhabit them as an actor might do and think, well, what would my response be in that situation? So I think that, hopefully it worked. It's hard for me to tell when you write a scene whether it works for the reader, but I tried to bring to that scene how I would feel had I been sitting there with Gloria watching that.
I feel it is tense, isn't it? I felt that when we were listening to it yesterday.
One of the ways you create tension as well in a narrative, it's a bit like how do you make people hungry? Well, you make them wait for dinner, basically. So tension comes from leaving people waiting to find out how this is going to pan out. And the challenge, of course, is to not stretch it out too thin or too long so that the reader no longer cares anymore because it's just gone on for too long. And the other pitfall is to do it too quickly so that you've barely had a chance to build up the tension before the scene's over. So that's one of the calibrations you have to use as an author, is to how far can I stretch this without taking it too far, and leave the reader on tenterhooks for what's going to happen.
Okay, thank you. And perhaps related to that is Lexi's question.
So my question is, why did you choose to write the main narrative in first person?
Okay, why did I choose a first-person narrative? Well, I debated about this because this was my third novel for young adults, and the first two had both been written in a third-person viewpoint because, as you will gather just from looking at me, I'm not a teenager, although I have been many years ago, and I was slightly wary in... appropriation is an issue in writing now that perhaps wasn't when I first started writing, but certainly is now. And I was aware of the fact that I might be stepping outside of my entitlement as an author to assume the guise or viewpoint or voice of a teenage character. So for the first two novels, I didn't do that. But by the third novel, I felt that, the way I just sort of allowed it to myself was that, well, I have been a teenager, and although I'm not one now, I can at least remember what that was like and try and inhabit a teenage viewpoint and voice in a way that, say, for example, I couldn't legitimately write in the voice of someone who was a different race or culture to me. I would feel much more uncomfortable about doing that. So this was the novel where I decided, well, I wanted to go into the first-person viewpoint. I wanted to draw the reader much more fully and immersively into the character's voice and viewpoint and mindset. And so that was the sort of rationale behind that. I think with a close third-person viewpoint, where you're limited to one character's viewpoint but using he or she rather than I, you can still create a kind of first-person feel about it. But I think with the first person itself, you can be much more immersive. The problem that comes with it, of course, is that you're limited to what that character experiences or sees or knows about or hears about, because you can't write about things that happen that they're not aware of. So it can be quite limiting in that sense.
There's actually a supplementary kind of question to that, which someone else has emailed to me, but who's not here. Would you say you intended to write Gloria as a naive character? Would that word be something that you would think?
No, I wouldn't have described her as naive. I did grapple with this problem with her, because one of the things you don't want to do with a protagonist in a novel is to have them to be passive. You need your protagonist to be active and to have agency and to take decisions and to sort of do things rather than have things done to them or around them. You don't want your main character to be a window on other people's interesting events or someone who has things happen to them rather than actively does things. So I wanted her to not be passive. But at the same time, I also wanted her to be enthralled to this larger-than-life character of Uman and get drawn into his world and to be not so much groomed by him, but seduced by him to the point where she behaves not so much out of character, but in a way that as used to be in her character, but is now no longer part of her character, but also in a more exaggerated way. Even in her more maverick, rule-breaking kind of days, Gloria would never have pushed the envelope as far as Uman does. So I wanted her to be both susceptible to being drawn into a world that she might have hesitated about entering, given her own free will, but also not to be naive enough to not be aware of what she was getting into with Uman. So I tried to make her not naive, but I was aware of the risk of her seeming to be too gullible and too susceptible. What I didn't want was for readers to say, why the hell would she go off with this guy in the first place? I wanted them to, even though they're aware of the danger she's getting into and the risks she's taking, I wanted them to understand why she was doing it. Really.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. We've partly got the answer already to Hamim's question, but do you want to? It's just a little bit more to it than just straightforward identification of the place. Hamim.
I was just going to ask, well, why is it the quarrying the old town?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was because it was a place that I lived near and had frequently visited, and had visited when this actual scene or a version of this scene had played out. I do find generally, though, just to open out the question in terms of drawing on personal experience or places that I'm aware of, that it does help with the continuity and authenticity. If you're describing a place that you're familiar with and have been to, you can or that you can choose to go to. And quite often I'll go and visit a place to sort of do research and take photographs because I want to set a novel there. I mean, part of the 20 Questions for Gloria, the latter part of the novel is set on the island of Briar in the Scilly Isles, and as indeed is the island of Lost Souls, the island that Finn goes to when he manages to dodge the draft, is based on Briar in the Scilly Isles. And I got a Society of Authors bursary to fund travel for research, for writing, and I used it to have a family holiday in Briar, basically, where I thought it would be interesting to set a novel on an island, and I used it for both of those novels. And that's where Gloria and Uman end up as well.
There's even a character in the Island of Lost Souls called
Briar. Yeah, I don't name the island as Briar, but the island was given another name. But yeah, so that's a sort of a nod to that. But I do find that if you go to a place or you know a place, that you bring a much greater degree of detail into the description of it on the page. And you don't get into those kind of continuity programs. Like the school that Uman and Gloria go to is based on a school that I went to, so that when they go from the science block to the language block, they're taking the same corridors and doing the same journey that they did last time. That I haven't forgotten where the rooms are in relation to each other, because I've made the building up. It's somewhere I'm familiar with and I can picture. It can get you into difficulty, because sometimes you assume you know a place better than you actually do. There's one of my novels, The Houdini Girl, which has got the poster for the German edition up there, is partly set in Oxford and partly set in Amsterdam. So I travelled to Amsterdam to do research and do site visits, and I went into a bar. I wanted to set a scene in one of the brown bars there, which is a bit like a brown cafe, which is a bit like an English pub, really. And I sort of sat there to write notes, and I wanted to set a scene in this actual place. And a guy at the next table ordered some cigarettes at the counter, and the waiter brought them over to the table, undid the cellophane wrapper and flipped open the lid and pulled one of the cigarettes partly out of the thing and then laid it on the table for the guy. And I incorporated that descriptive moment into the scene that I wrote in the novel. Now that's like one sentence in a 75,000 word novel. It wouldn't matter if that sentence wasn't in the novel, but if you have enough of those little descriptive details, it provides a kind of a layering of authenticity that I wouldn't have ever imagined that, by not visiting that. I wouldn't have imagined that happening. I'd have probably written a much more generic guy in a bar ordering a drink kind of scene. But those little details can add a sort of degree of authenticity. But this is a very long-winded answer. But the other downside is that sometimes you become complacent. So the Oxford part of the Houdini Girl, I thought I knew Oxfordshire really well. I'd worked there for 5 years as a journalist on the local paper. I'd covered the area as a reporter. And I have my character travelling by train from Abingdon to London at one point, until someone at a reading pointed out to me that there is no railway station in Abingdon. The nearest station is in Didcot, and you can't travel by train from Abingdon to London. So you do sometimes, you can get caught out by thinking you know a place better than you do, really. I got round that by saying my novel was set in an imagined near future where we had a proper transport infrastructure in this country, but...
Right, we've just got time for two more questions, I think, and they're about the more kind of the sort of the bigger picture of writing this novel. Samir.
What made you want to write a psychological thriller?
That's a good question, really. I don't know if I ever sat down and thought I want to write a psychological thriller. I mean, I enjoy reading them, but I read quite widely across a lot of different genres, so it wasn't as if that genre was the one I read most. And actually, a lot of writers write away from the genre they most like reading, bizarrely. So I don't think it was a conscious decision that I must sit down and write a psychological thriller. I think all of my novels, the way I've approached them in terms of genre or what category they might come under has been driven by the story, really, and what the situation is. And the first novel, Acts of Revision, is about a guy who is emotionally disturbed. His mother's just died. He's sorting out the house. He's in his 30s. He's sort of got issues in his past that still trouble him. And when he's sorting out his mother's house, he comes across all of his old school reports in an attic and reads some of the horrible things that his teachers wrote about him. And he remembers being traumatised and upset by them. And he feels that his teachers set him up badly for life. And he blames them, and the trauma of his mother dying sends him over the edge, and he starts tracking them down and exacting various revenges on them. So that the story setup just seemed to scream psychological thriller, really. I mean, so I think it came off the back of the idea for the storyline, suggested what the genre should be, rather than thinking of the genre and then finding a storyline, if that makes sense.
But I don't see you going on to write a rom-com.
No, I wouldn't say that's happening anytime soon. No.
And Brogan.
Yeah, so between this novel and The Island of Lost Souls, both sort of focus on ideas of like freedom and escape. So I was just wondering what sort of draws you to stories about that, what makes you want to write about that?
Yeah, I think it must be something in me. I mean, writers tend not to psychoanalyse themselves if they can help it, because there's a danger that you sort of, I say, kill the goose that lays the golden egg. Danger that you damage your creative spark that creates this stuff in the first place, that if you probe it too much, you sort of analyse it to the point where you've lost it, really. So most writers don't overthink that aspect of things. I remember doing an interview with someone who was researching a PhD on the connection between being an only child and being creative, because apparently there does seem to be a strong connection that only children tend to be far more creative proportionately than people who aren't only children. It's not to say that people who've got siblings can't also be creative, but just as a proportion, she's developing this theory. And because I'm an only child, she interviewed me about that. And I remember feeling quite uncomfortable during the interview that she's digging into areas that I feel are better off buried in my psyche, so that I can bring them onto the page from my unconscious rather than have them in my conscious mind. And as a result of that, I've already forgotten what your question was.
It was what draws you to stories about like freedom and escape.
Exactly, yes, I knew that. Yeah. And I think there's something buried in me that I've always been attracted to this idea of, rule breaking and transgression has always appealed to me. I mean, colleagues of mine will know that I'm not particularly good at towing the corporate line when it comes to being someone who's employed by an organisation or by an institution, and that's always been the case, really. Even as a young child, I ran away from home when I was 7. I took all my pocket money, which amounted to about sort of 15p, which was a lot of money in those days. And I walked down to the bus stop that's about a quarter of a mile away at the end of the road. Mum and Dad were in the lounge watching television. I just let myself out of the house, walked down to the bus stop, sat there, got bored waiting for a bus, and walked back home again and let myself in, and realised that my mum and Dad were completely oblivious that I'd run away from home. So yeah, and I always had this idea. My mum and Dad lived in a house with a series of back gardens of houses in that row. And I always had the idea of wanting to escape home by running and climbing over other people's back garden fences and sort of seeing where that would lead. And I had this idea for a novel in which someone just travels around the entire world by crossing into other people's back gardens. So I think basically because I'm weird, I think, is the answer to your question. Yeah.
But I mean, it's a major theme, isn't it? And so it's something that we probably, we all at some level relate to. In the island, in the 20 Questions for Gloria, it's she goes on her adventure in the Island of Lost Souls. He's trying to find a way to not be controlled by society, but it's quite difficult, isn't it? And I
mean, to some, it depends on your perspective as well, because to some people, fighting for your country would be the adventure, wouldn't it? For fearless avoidance of that's the adventure. So any of those of you who've seen All Quiet on the Western Front recently, the 4 main characters who go off to fight, the 4 German young lads who go off to fight, they see it as an exciting adventure when they set off. They have no idea what's in store for them in the trenches, but at that point that is their adventure. So yeah, and as writers yourselves, all of you doing English subject areas will be writers yourselves, you know that sometimes you can put your finger on where your ideas come from, but sometimes they come from some deep part of your psyche or experience that you're pleased with the results on the page, but you don't want to dig too deep into why you've written that stuff.
Well, thank you very much, Martyn, for allowing us to dig deep into these two novels and the things behind it.
Room now, yeah.
And indeed, we are going to go on after the end of this recording you're going to lead us in a creative writing workshop. So
I don't know if I can now. I'm too traumatized.
So I'd just like to say thank you very much indeed for taking the time to do this, and thank you to everybody for your questions, which in fact when I showed them to Martyn before the session, he said, what a great set of questions.
They were. One of the things Richard said earlier is about this is sort of similar to what might happen at a literature festival, but actually one of the things that's been really nice about it is that it's very different in the sense that we're asking specific questions about particular aspects of writing. At literature festivals, you often get the more generic questions of, do you use a word processor, or, what's your favourite food and things like that, really weird kinds of questions. But it's really nice to dig down into the nitty-gritty. So, yeah, thank you for your questions and for your time. It's been really interesting.
Okay, thank you. Let's give them that.
You can find out more about English at Leeds Trinity from our Leeds Trinity University website at www.leedstrinity.ac.uk, and also from our at Leeds Trinity channel on YouTube, and from our Twitter account at LTU English. Thank you for listening, and thank you to Steve Oxton and FesleyanStudios.com for this music, which is called Rio After Dark.